This year marks the 44th anniversary of the murder in detention. Steve Biko, to commemorate his life and legacy, UNISA, in partnership with the Steve Biko Foundation, will this evening host the 21st annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. The lecture will be delivered virtually by Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, Regional Director for Africa of the World Health Organization. Now let's get more about the lecture. We're joined via Zoom by the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of South Africa, Professor Puleng LenkaBula. Professor, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Unati, for inviting us. We appreciate the opportunity to share about this icon of our revolution, Steve Biko.
And actually, there's absolutely no way to start. Where do you start speaking about this man? But perhaps let's start here. There's probably no better time in our country, more needed than now, to reflect on the contribution of the late Steve Biko, especially in the context where we find ourselves today from a social, political, and even an ethical perspective. How should his legacy be honored by South Africans?
Thank you very much. The University of South Africa, in its reflections, has found it imperative to projecting African intellectuals and liberation icons. Steve Biko is one of them. He represents, in the political history of South Africa, but also the continent and the global arena, the idea of emancipation, the idea of the respect for human dignity, and the challenge to the ideological weapons of death, such as apartheid, colonialism, and the agency that youth and young adults must demonstrate in participating and contributing to these liberational aspects and practices. And as part of reclaiming Africa's intellectual futures, we have found it important to reread revolutions, as well as looking at icons such as Steve Biko, who did not only participate in shaping the ethical participation in anti-apartheid systems, but he actually, as a student, as a leader, ensured that the voices of the youth in shaping and claiming what South Africa ought to be were projected. He did not only do so, he wrote, he reflected on the state of apartheid regime. He contested and called and spoke out against the injustices. And his death is a testament to the challenges he spoke about. And youth and young adults today, universities such as UNISA, our society must take cognizance of the efforts and the life and work of icons such as this, especially in the context of COVID-19 and beyond.
Prof, I'd like to hone in on what you've just said. Uba Biko, we know that he really did believe in human dignity, and he was at pains to stress that he was not anti-white, but that he rather championed the cause for Black South Africans and inculcated a sense of pride in them throughout his life. What do you think that this could have been seen as anything but advocating for humanity amongst all races, especially denouncing white brutality against a Black child in the country of his birth?
Yes, colonial discourse and apartheid discourse or apologists often mute and silence those who call to question or accountability white supremacy and white supremacy ideologies, economic infrastructures, but also ideological weapons of death that I've referred to earlier on. And I think it is imperative that in his book, I Write What I Like, Steve Biko was reaffirming and reasserting the idea of self-determination, the idea of speaking out to economic systems, ideological systems that undermine the integrity or the humanity of Black people. And it is very important that even in the current conjuncture, Black people must not feel uncomfortable asserting their value systems, their dignity, and their co-construction of a world that we live in. Slavery, apartheid, colonialism, and continued neoliberal ideologies that have tended to undermine the humanity of Black people oftentimes silence these views. And I'm of the view that his contribution is an invitation for Black people, but also other marginalized communities, such as people living with disabilities, for example, to always question, but also call to order and to transformation these ideas that may denigrate or undermine the humanity of others. And therefore, I suggest that those who are on the margins ought not to feel afraid to call out the injustices. And therefore, if white people do not see Biko's legacy as holding accountable the values of human rights, the values of human dignity that are enshrined in the United Nations ideas around human rights and conventions and so on, then it would be mischievous, if not duplicitous, that they do so. The second aspect is that those who are privileged by white supremacist systems must also, as part of transforming our society, unlearn the privileges that were bequeathed by an unjust system in order that they become participants in contributing towards the change, which is what Biko asserted in his philosophies. One thing I really appreciate about the legacy of Ntate Bantu Biko was the fact that he did not only impel students, Black people, white people, to coming together to affirming the dignity of all in South Africa. His legacy is demonstrated at universities such as UCLA. You'll find that in the works of theologians such as James Cone, in the works of intellectuals who agitated for civil rights in the United States, the Angela, for instance, Davis, the works of Biko resonate. So he did not only affirm this dignity for the context of South Africa, he realized that the liberation of all people who are marginalized are entwined, and the ecosystems of justice must therefore be built and harnessed and be relevant and resonant for all marginalized people in the world. And that's something that is important to calling, to ensuring that universities such as University of South Africa, take seriously, because the emancipatory projects are entwined with the planetary efforts of ecological justice, economic justice. And if we disentangle or decouple our own liberation efforts, our own quest for freedom, for transformation, for knowledge systems of Africa becoming central to the transformation and shaping of futures, then we will be somewhat complicit to the very systems, machinations, and ideologies that undermine this dignity. And for us, therefore, we appreciate this legacy, this work, this agitation that all of us must take responsibility for shaping futures, and as such must ensure that the dignity of humanity of all trampled people or marginalized people, and in particular of Black people due to racism, apartheid, colonialism, and other intersectional systems that draw on these ideas are overcome. And for me, it's not just his views, his works, his ideas are not just relevant to histories, to human rights discourses and cultures, to human dignity discourses, but they also speak to the ideas of how do we create economic systems that are attentive to the exigencies of people? How do we ensure that economic decisions that we take in South Africa, in the continent, do not denigrate the very dignity of Africans, of Black people, in the ways that colonial systems and apartheid systems did? And therefore, it is an invitation for all people, scholars, intellectuals, academics, students, to really rally behind his works, his philosophies, because they are about building Ubuntu, they are about dignity, they are about holding accountable the leaders that we elect in order to see whether the policies that they enact are transformative, build communities of dignity, and enable the flourishing of societies here at home, but also in the nexus of the global arena.
Prof, you've raised some very interesting and powerful points there, and I'd like us to go back to what you said about those that are brave enough to call out injustice, especially the youth, when we have time. But first, perhaps let's zone in on tonight's lecture that is around the pandemic. I mean, it's been revealed on several occasions how the COVID-19 pandemic has further uncovered the inequality, or uncovered rather the inequality in this country and Africa at large. And in fact, in his quote, which I'd like to quickly just quote, he says, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." So what can we draw about just how this global COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccination drive has further divided the haves, which is the West, from the have-nots? Professor, are you still with us? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. You're right. One of the things, Unati, that you'd recognize that, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Unati?
Yeah, I'm here, Prof. You can
continue.
You
hear me?
Yes, you can continue.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can. You can continue, Prof.
Thank you. One of the observations, Unati, that we should also acknowledge is that COVID-19 exposed to us the inequalities in the global system, access to health systems. The whole distribution of vaccine has been a contested, if not quite unkind, systems for us to observe. You'll realize that the global North had access to vaccines, to PPEs, and to the support of health systems. Yet many in the global South, including in South Africa, only accessed health systems against COVID-19 recently. That vaccine injustice or dissonance is one of the areas that universities such as ours, but also universities in the global South, must start working on, because we cannot be dependent on others for the well and well-being of our communities or our societies. Dr. Moeti, as a specialist in health systems, will attest to the fact that the legacies of Biko on trying to ensure that we equalize access to health systems, we build ecosystems of justice where people do not lose lives just because they come from context of inequality or marginalization or poverty, are quite important, especially at this point. But it is not only in the distributive aspects of COVID-19 that we realize the dissonances around human rights, around dignity, around social justice, and around this idea of collaboration. We also realize how the hypocrisy of the global North, which oftentimes suggests that they're in solidarity with the global South, with Africa and with South Africa, has been pointed. Because at a time when we truly needed these vaccines to help our communities, that's when many countries became protective and only wanted the vaccines for themselves. This is a telling point for us as Africans, as South Africans, that we cannot develop ecosystems of success. We cannot develop economic systems that are successful if we constantly look at the other to shaping how our economic systems must be. We must, like Biko has asserted, ensure that we take moral agency, responsibility, and accountability to building our economic infrastructures beyond dependency theories that scholars such as Amina Mama, Oba Adebayo Olokoshi, or even Sameh Amin, through their notion of delinking, have asserted. Because when we are societies that are dependent, we then find that we cannot even assert our own political liberation, our own ideas of changing the world for the better, something that Biko cherished, that we must be at the center of the developments that are resourceful for the flourishing of our societies, especially for the flourishing of the trampled upon.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure reflecting on the life and the times of Babu Steve Bantu Biko. Thank you so much for your time on the channel.
Thank you, Unati. We look forward to you watching and reflecting with us at 6 tonight. Thank you very much. We wish you well.
Thank you. Of course, Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of South Africa, Professor Puleng LenkaBula, there speaking just under 2 hours ahead of that lecture by Dr. Matshidiso Moeti. And this is the annual Steve Biko Lecture later on at 6 p.m.